Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Welcome, welcome. So my name is Kyle George, and I'm going to be with you for the next hour, so we'll get started. Thank you for joining our panel titled Root Causes of Gun Violence and Attorney General Response. This panel is being sponsored by the Progressive State Leaders Committee, which is the 501c4 affiliate of the Democratic Attorneys General Association. I am the former First Assistant Attorney General for the state of Nevada. I worked under the Attorney General Ford administration for 4 years, and although I'm no longer with the office, I currently serve as a legal fellow with the Leadership Center for Attorney General Studies. I'm going to play lawyer for just a minute here with you. I am moderating this panel in my personal capacity. So if you hear something, if I say something you don't like, it's not them, it's me. It's none of my bosses, it's me, okay? So keep that in mind. This is all me. So we have a phenomenal panel with us today. Joining us remotely is California Attorney General Rob Bonta, who has the distinction of being the first person of Filipino descent and the second Asian American to serve in this role. AG Bonta previously served as a San Francisco city attorney, an Alameda council member, and a state assemblyman. He is a champion of racial, economic, and environmental justice and has worked to further the rights of immigrant families, renters, and working Californians. Immediately to my left is Pastor Brenda Mitchell, Everytown Senior Fellow and with the Survivor Network. Pastor Mitchell is a state chapter co-leader for Moms Demand Action in Illinois, and she's an MSBR Compassion Certified Grief Support Specialist in trauma and complicated grief, and holds a certificate in mindfulness as well. She will discuss what that means during her time. In addition to her work with Everytown, Pastor Mitchell is an active member with Purpose Over Pain, which is an anti-gun violence advocacy organization here in Chicago. Immediately to her left is the AG the Attorney General traveling the furthest to get here, Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul. AG Raoul is a Chicago native and the son of Haitian immigrants. As an immigrant, I always give shout outs to immigrants. Prior to his election to AG in 2018, he served in the Illinois State Senate, where he was a leading voice for equal rights and a woman's right to choose, among many other issues. And then finally, to his left, we have Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. A.G. Ellison is the first African American and first Muslim American to be elected to statewide office in Minnesota. Prior to being elected to this office, he represented Minnesota in the United States House of Representatives. You will almost certainly know A.G. Ellison for his role in the successful prosecution of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who murdered George Floyd. So this is our panel here today. We look forward to a really good conversation. Let's start off by giving each panelist a couple of minutes, do a quick overview of their work as in their respective roles, and perhaps give an example of specifics on what they've done in that space. Since A.G. Bonta is joining us remotely, I think we can start with him and then move to my left.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah. We sure can.
Wonderful to be with you remotely, and shout out to my colleagues, A.G. Ellison and A.G. Raoul. Thank you, Pastor Mitchell, and thank you to our wonderful moderator for bringing us together today, Rob Bonta, California Attorney General. And I wanted to say thank you to Netroots Nation and Progressive State Leaders Committee for your efforts for bringing us together on this important topic. And I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. And I can, even through Zoom, sense the energy and the passion on this issue, which we are all appropriately so passionate about. And addressing gun safety and gun violence and supporting our communities has been something I've done throughout my career as a deputy city attorney in San Francisco, later as a legislator in the California State Assembly for almost a decade, and then for my over 2 years as California Attorney General. And while I certainly approach this work as in my official capacity, I also see it as a dad, and I know many of us do. We see this work; it's personal to us. We see it as parents, and we all have our own individual interactions with gun violence. Mine involved my then high school age daughter being in high school, jumping on the group text that my wife Mia and I share with her, and while in school saying, Dad, we're on lockdown. We have an active shooter. Not a drill, an active shooter. And we were miles away, unable to help, feeling the anxiety, the helplessness, the desire to want to need to know more, but the inability to do so. And seconds and minutes felt like hours and days. She was able to check in very rarely, and ultimately she was able to tell us that the threat had passed, thankfully, and she was safe. And so we know we are lucky, and it's not true for many throughout this country. And that should not be a group text that parents share with their children. That should not be a conversation that is so common in this country. And I also come at this work as someone who represented Oakland, Alameda, and San Leandro, the Great East Bay, where unfortunately there were major spikes in gun violence over the years that I represented those great areas. And we know that gun violence is America's disease, unique in the world in America. We lead as a country in so many things that we should be proud of. We should not be proud of this. And it is a choice. We can do better. It doesn't have to be this way. There are common sense, data-driven policies and approaches that we know will reduce gun violence. And even in California, where we have some of the strongest gun laws in the nation, and as a result have some of the lowest firearm mortality rates in the nation, we are not immune. We suffer from gun violence and mass shootings. And to cure a disease, you have to get at its roots, stop it before it spreads, and eradicate it from where it began. And that means we can't just treat the symptoms. We need prevention. We need intervention. That's why I set up my Office of Gun Violence Prevention in the California Attorney General's office and reached out to our great community advocates and hired one of the leaders from Giffords to lead our team and to help share the best approaches and best practices to prevent gun violence on the front end. And that includes gun violence restraining orders or red flag laws. It also includes violence intervention programs like ceasefire and peacekeepers. And so we brought Arlie Freilich on board to help lead that work. And we know that there are a lot of important approaches that aren't being utilized everywhere they can make a difference, everywhere they can save a life, everywhere they can decrease gun violence. And so our office is going to be a clearinghouse for research and data and best practices, and we're going to share those out throughout California. And we're proud of that work, stopping gun violence from happening in the first place. And we know that we have to lean into this work. We need to continue to be courageous. We need to continue to go where the American people want us to go, to take all those common sense steps to reduce gun violence, whether it be a ban on assault weapons, a ban on large capacity magazines, red flag laws, background checks. The people know that they work. They're right. The data shows it, and they want us to implement that anywhere and everywhere that we can. So we know that thoughts and prayers are not sufficient. We need action, and we need bold action. And in California, we're doing our part. Thank you.
Thank you, General Bonta. Pastor Mitchell.
That was a lot to follow, I tell you. Thank you. The impact of gun violence on me has been one of a personal nature, but it also has been one of an historical nature when we talk about generational violence. I also lost a brother to gun violence, but I most recently after that lost a son to gun violence. A week after sending one son overseas for Iraqi freedom, I lost my other son a week later in a free country, and the parody of that. And that I lost Kenneth, but I was propelled to action, and I was propelled to make sure that another mother did not have the experience that I had. I did not realize what the impact of that loss would be until 12 years into my recovery. I actually received a traumatic response to it and PTSD. And from there, I almost lost my life 3 times through that process. And when I came back from that, I felt that I came back better than I was before I experienced that. But I was also propelled even further to make sure that this is not our experience and that we make a stand. And I often tell people all the time, and this is my mantra. Anywhere you hear me, you'll hear me say this. I often tell people, do not put a period behind my son's name, because his mom is still talking and she's still standing. As long as she's still speaking, my son is speaking to the masses as well. And so people often say, why do you speak? Why do you talk? I am the subject matter expert, in that I had to do the research on a personal level. And coming through that, I can speak to the issues, but I can also speak to the emotional trauma that it comes. So gun violence is gun violence. It is about gun violence, but there's a subset to gun violence that nobody gets to hear. That's my platform, to make sure that those of us that are like the walking wounded and wake up every morning with a broken heart, but choose to live and choose to make a difference in a world that, does not always care. But my father once told me, and always told us, what we do to the better good of humanity. And that is how I started, and that will be how I finish this race.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and welcome to Chicago for those of you all who are not from here. While you're here, enjoy Chicago. Don't listen to how Chicago has been characterized internationally. Chicago is a wonderful place. Yes, we do have our issues with gun violence, and it has touched me personally. I raised my kids in a home where during the time I was raising them, we had multiple incidents of gun violence directly outside of our home. A 13-year-old boy was shot across the street from our home. At the time, my son was 13, and I had to tell the family who was bringing him home from basketball practice, please bring him home to your home, because I haven't figured out how to explain to him that a boy his age was shot right outside of his home. So in my work, both in the General Assembly over 14 years, it is the inspiration of having to have those conversations with my children and having to console my friends who have lost sons and daughters to gun violence on too many occasions. And so that's why I lent myself to coming into contact with an organization called Alliance for Safety and Justice that introduced me to trauma recovery centers, and I sponsored legislation to pilot trauma recovery centers here in the state of Illinois. That's why I sponsored legislation to make sure that we had FOID card verifications such that, and FOID card, for those of you all who aren't from here, is a firearm owner's ID. And oftentimes when people become ineligible to possess a FOID card, it's not like they voluntarily turn it in, so they can still end up purchasing guns or having guns transferred to them when they're ineligible to possess them and when they're a danger to the public. And it's why I sponsored legislation to report lost and stolen weapons, because if we're not doing that, we're not really doing our job to track the trafficking of weapons into the hands of people that we know we're going to do harm with it. But when I started 4.5 years ago as Illinois' 42nd Attorney General, in my inauguration speech, I specifically said that fighting gun violence was my #1 priority, and that it wasn't going to be just a one-step approach towards doing it. It was going to be a comprehensive approach, beginning with changing the way that our crime victim services work. I understood from my time as a juvenile prosecutor that normalized violence and trauma coming from violence can turn one who was initially a victim of gun violence into a perpetrator of the same if you're not treating the trauma that comes along. So I made sure I changed the practices of our office that excluded giving crime victim compensation dollars to those who might have been involved with the system before, because if we're ignoring servicing those who have been traumatized because of their background, then we're not doing an adequate job of fighting gun violence. I instructed my office to have a gun violence internal task force where we were breaking down the silos of our office. We made sure consumer protection was talking to criminal prosecutions, was talking to our public interest bureau, making sure on a monthly basis we get together. And that's why we partnered with every town in the city of Kansas City to sue the ATF that had licensed a rogue gun manufacturer that had declared bankruptcy and re-emerged under another name. It was Jimenez Arms, and then they got sued and re-emerged as JA Industries. They made guns that no law-abiding gun owner would want to own. They made throwaway guns that are used in carjackings and other crimes. And so ATF agreed to re-review the licensing, and they revoked the licensing of that rogue gun manufacturer. But we knew that wasn't enough, so this past legislative session, I asked for consumer fraud authority to sue those in the firearms industry that are marketing to children and marketing to the illegal militia, and we were granted that, and we're waiting on the governor's signature to that. We also, again, partnering with every town and MK Analytics, we created Crime Gun Connect, which is a crime gun tracing platform, so we can know when law enforcement recovers a gun, what pathway that gun took to get to the end user, how long it took to get from its initial sale to its use in a crime. And that will help us not only hold responsible those who perpetrate the crime with the gun, but those who knowingly traffic guns to those who are doing harm in our neighborhoods. We know that the neighborhoods where most of the gun violence occurs, aren't the neighborhoods that manufacture or legally sell guns. And so we can't only focus on holding those accountable who are the end user, but we have to hold those accountable who are trafficking guns to them. I could go on, but I'm gonna leave some time for my buddy here.
I'm surprised you're doing this. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great to be with my dear friend Kwame Raoul, Rob Bonta, and with you, Pastor. And
Thank you.
I don't think there's a more important conversation that we could be having in our country right now. There are conversations that are as important, but I don't think there's any that are more important. I'll just start out by saying, you know, look, it's not a matter of the right to bear arms. It's a right to sell arms. That's what this is about. Tragedy follows people thinking, well, I need a gun, right? So Uvalde happens, you know, Sandy Hook happens. Sadly, the response is, well, I need a gun, and gun sales go up. So we have this ugly, self-perpetuating cycle where good, decent people feel they need a gun to protect themselves from gun violence. And we've got to break that cycle. Let me tell you, last year, there was a beautiful, wonderful young lady who was a veterinary tech. And she was out partying in St. Paul. Some guys started shooting at each other and hit her. 14 people are hit, but this young lady, Markeisha Wiley, dies right there on West 7th Avenue in St. Paul. Well, they found the person who shot her, and he was prosecuted for murder. And then they found with the tracing, Kwame, that this gun happened to be sold to a guy who bought 37 guns from the same company within a few weeks. All the same versions. When they went to his house, guess how many guns they found? None, because he sold them all. Okay, so that company sold the guns. The company's owned by a well-respected Minnesota family. They're the member of yacht clubs and tennis clubs and country clubs. Well, wait a minute, don't they have some responsibility? Well, We can sue the shooter, we can sue the straw purchaser criminally, but we sued the seller. The name of that company is Fleet Farm, and they are facing civil liability from us right this very second because they negligently sold guns. Because we believe that we are alleging that they engaged in negligence, negligent entrustment, and nuisance, and other causes of action. And they're not the only ones who sold a grip of guns to people who they should not have sold them to within a short period of time. But we're plucking the fruit closest to us. We'll get to the other ones later. And my message is, you don't want to get sued. Don't sell guns to people who don't supposed to have them legally. And I think that, I think if you want to stop this problem, you have got to go up the chain. Some people just say prosecute gun crime. Well, let me just tell you this. We should prosecute gun crime. How many days have we had in 2023 so far? Does anybody know offhand? 180, 190 days? A little bit more. Maybe a little bit more? Well, we've had maybe 340 mass shootings. Not shootings, mass shootings, where 4 or more people were shot in the same behavioral incident. Now, a year ago, President Biden signed the most important gun legislation since the expiration of the assault ban. And that was important. States are reacting. Thank good for Illinois. I think Minnesota's taking action. And we are moving. But the problem here is that fear is driving gun sales, and gun sales are driving gun violence. And we have got to break that cycle. I could go on as well. I'll tell you that I'm very proud that Rob, Kwame, and I and our colleagues, after President Biden said you're not going to sell guns with no serial numbers on them, which is all a ghost gun is. There was some Republican AGs who sued him, and so we opposed them. So AGs we are fighting to protect administrative rules of the administration. We are filing lawsuits of our own. We are working with law schools and law students, and we're working with community, with the leadership of people like the pastor, and we are on the forefront of this fight. Anybody who wants to go on and on and on about crime and violence and lock them up in law and order, but is allowing guns to be sold here, there, and everywhere is a hypocrite. You cannot discuss crime and not discuss the proliferation of guns, the ubiquity of guns. They are inconsistent. You cut the number of guns, you're going to cut the number of deaths. You're going to reduce the amount of crime. Last thing, the number one leading cause of death for white men over 50 is suicide. If you had a waiting period, these brothers of ours, our fellow Americans, might be able to get a moment where they can get a family member, somebody who cares about them, to intervene. This is not just a brown people problem. This is an everybody problem. If you're a school kid, that's a problem no matter what color you might be. Mm-hmm. The problem is, we have got to confront how race enters into this debate because it's killing us. And people think they might not be victim because they're not in what the media says are the people normally mixed up in this, but everybody's mixed up in this. I yield back.
Thank you. Gotta love the passion of all the speakers. One thing I want to highlight, every single person had specific personal stories about gun violence. I think very often we frame this as a political issue. Not we, I'm sorry. A lot of people out there like to frame this as a political issue. This isn't political, this is personal.
That's right.
I mean, it's directly touched the lives of every panelist that's with us today. So just wanted to acknowledge that. There were several comments on what these officers are doing. The AG's officers are doing with gun violence. I think I glossed over the threshold question. What is an AG? What does an AG do? So General Raul, you mind taking that really quickly? And then one thing I want to flag, General Bonta, I can't see you. on my screen. So if you ever want to jump in anytime, please make a loud noise. Just jump right in. I think this will go better as a conversation instead of me just directing questions. So let's open that up. So General.
So in the 50 states and some of the territories, we have AGs that serve as the chief legal officer of the state. So it's a dual or multi-level representation because we represent the state, state officials and state agencies, but we also more broadly represent the people of our state. And so some of these actions that we take in consumer protection and others is not in representation of the state government, but it's in representation of the people of the state for the harms that come upon the people of the state. So if it's our action against ATF or if it's our action against a gun manufacturer, that's on behalf of the people, not on behalf of the government. We have different sectors of our respective offices, and it varies from state to state what kind of criminal jurisdiction we have. But we have consumer protection, criminal prosecutions, antitrust. What am I leaving out?
We can go on and on.
Yeah, but that's it. A bit of everything.
Yeah, and thanks for that. I think it's really important to understand the landscape because understanding that landscape means you can understand the authorities they have to deal with this issue.
However, it's important to restate, and I think Keith is in a similar position, and Rob, I'm not sure what type of criminal prosecution authority. A lot of people will often ask me, I'll just keep it to Illinois, well, why aren't you prosecuting this case or prosecuting that case? We usually yield to the local state's attorney or another state's local district attorney. We don't have that original jurisdiction. I know before Keith, for instance, took over the prosecution, I think it was the governor that gave him authority. But originally, the district attorney would have had that authority. Right. So unless there's conflict or the district attorney pulls us in, we have certain matters where we have statewide grand jury authority. Gun trafficking just happens to be one of them, but it has to be something that crosses county boundaries.
Right. I mean, and you're in a terrible position at times where you're very visible at the state level. You're a visible symbol of law enforcement, but you may lack statutory authority to act in specific incidents. And I think it's really important the public is aware of that. Where I want to lead this conversation to is the idea of gun control, gun regulation. I think the opponents of gun safety laws generally have taken an approach in the last few years that any legislation related to guns is anti-gun and anti-Second Amendment. And I think that completely misstates your positions. I would love to hear from all of you what gun safety law really means, and especially for the constitutional officers here, how you resolve that with the fact that a Second Amendment does exist. So can you help navigate that? And I'm not going to call in names, so we can just get you all involved. So jump right in, whoever wants to take this.
And then I'm going to let the Attorney General jump in on this one. Because from a constituency and on a personal level, and representing an organization, Everytown Survivor Network and Moms Demand Action, I think it's very clear that we're the ones that primarily are called those critics of the Second Amendment. And my husband, who has been military, retired from military, training academy for sheriff's police, and has always owned a gun. A gun has always been present in my house. And I thank God for having a sensible man that actually locked his gun up so that his children were not exposed and that there would not be any intentional shootings in our house. I think the other part of it is that we're not anti-gun or Second Amendment. He's confirmed in his Second Amendment rights, and as a man, he's not intimidated by doing the right thing. However, what we are is anti-gun violence, and with those rights comes responsibilities. And what we're asking for is responsibility means doing everything we can to make sure that those who carry guns are not a danger to themselves and to others. This is the commitment that we made. Parents are fed up with wondering whether their children will be shot, and the statements that are made, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't understand how you can be in the wrong place when you're in your bed. Those are the issues that we face in our communities. Children used to want to grow up to be doctors, nurses, state's attorney generals, and that's not their wish anymore. They're wanting to be able to live, to go to school, when they get to school, not to be afraid whether I'll make it home. When I lay down in my bed, will I be able to wake up in the morning and try to repeat this whole pattern over? We owe it to them. Generation Z was on this morning, and to hear them talk and to know that they're the next level, we're ushering in a whole level of understanding that we will not be quiet. You know, we're committing genocide, and we have a problem with people that have no problem with burying our children in a free country. This is where we draw the line. This is where we continue to stand up. This is where we continue to say, it's not anti-Second Amendment. It's anti-you taking my child out of my house and being comfortable and okay with it. I don't stand for Kenneth anymore. Kenneth and I have had our moment. I stand for everybody else in behind me, and hopefully that number decreases to the point where we eradicate it.
You know, I think one, and Brenda said it all basically, but I think one of the things that I don't think we talk about enough is that the vast majority of gun owners support common sense policy to keep people safe from guns. The organizations that purport to represent those gun owners take a different position because they represent the interests of gun manufacturers and those who sell guns, and not necessarily the vast majority of gun owners who support background checks, for example, who have no desire to own certain assault weapons, who support making sure those with developmental disabilities and those who have proven themselves a threat to the public safety not having access to guns. So this notion, and I think Barack Obama talked about it years ago, and he suffered as a result of it, but I guess he didn't suffer, he won the presidency, but he talked about this falsified fear of people going and prying guns away from law-abiding gun owners. That's not what anybody here is trying to do.
So let me just say, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people, which is a collective term, to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Actually, the Heller decision, which is the one where Scalia found a private gun right, is a legal fiction. It is judicial activism. It's reading something into the text that's not there. Simple as that. And Bruin, which says that every state has to be a shall-issue state, is completely a usurpation of the state prerogative to set health and safety laws. So we're living in an era where the Second Amendment has been completely mangled and extended and invented by people who want to see more guns. And I'm just going to say this. I think that we need to just accept the fact that the outcome we have is the desired one by people who are doing everything they can to bring us to this outcome. Nobody wants to be like, well, they don't really want all these gun deaths, do they? They couldn't possibly want that. Yes, they do, because the fear drives gun sales. Every time there's a mass shooting, people run to the gun shop to buy a gun because they don't want to be without if they need one. We should accuse them of what they're producing, which is the single most violent industrialized society in the world. And so I'll say that the whole Second Amendment to me is just look, all we're saying is that the Congress and the states and the cities can regulate guns. Yes. That's all we're saying. We can regulate guns. And what they're saying is, you may not regulate guns. They are sacred instruments, and you may not tell us anything. And you got me, you wonder, where is this going? Can you have an M16? Can you? Yeah, you can. Can you have an F-16? Maybe you can. I mean, so there is no logical stopping point to what they're arguing right here. So I think the Second Amendment is a red herring. I think we're not talking about the Second Amendment that's written in the Constitution. We're talking about something else that Clarence Thomas imagined. And I'm sure that, you know, probably Harlan Crow told him what his opinion needed to be on that. So anyway, that's what I got to say about the Second Amendment.
Yeah, and can I jump in, Mr. George, for a moment?
Please do, please.
Yeah, I just want to add on to all that. Appreciate all those important points. And you know, right now we have a lot of people around this country who are saying that the Second Amendment is absolute, that any law that tries to do anything to keep people and communities safe through common sense regulation is violative of the Second Amendment, and it's just not true. And what they want, the gun industry wants, is a right for unlimited profit to sell as many guns and to as many people in as many places as they can. And
that's what they want.
That is not a right that I've ever seen in the U.S. Constitution.
That's not a right.
And we do have a right to be free from gun violence, to be safe in our communities and in our neighborhoods. And the court has said that time and time again, even courts that I haven't agreed with, including the Heller Court and the Bruen Court. In the Heller case, the court said that the Second Amendment should not be seen to confer a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. That's what they're trying to say. Many are trying to say the Second Amendment allows for, but the Heller Court struck that down. It also stated that regulations on guns that prevent felons or the mentally ill from obtaining weapons, restrict gun possession in sensitive places like schools, like government buildings, and impose conditions on commercial gun purchases, that those are presumptively lawful. And that the Second Amendment doesn't prevent laws banning dangerous and unusual weapons, like A.G. Ellison was mentioning, like M16s. Bruen, more recently, said that policymakers are not in a regulatory straitjacket, that we can take steps to regulate guns, and including making sure that only responsible, law-abiding citizens have them, and that they're not used in sensitive sites, and that we can take reasonable safety screens. So it is a political, ideological point to say that the Second Amendment protects the sale of any gun anywhere to anyone. It's not rooted in anything lawful or in any common sense.
What A.G. Bonta says is absolutely right, and thank you for laying the law out there clearly. But all of us are dealing with the aftermath of Bruen. For example, right now, Minnesota had a law that said, well, you can't get a gun until you're 21, which seems like a safe, reasonable regulation, given that, we say you can't drink till you're 21. Now you can't get cigarettes till you're 21. 21 is looked at as an age where, we're going to say this is where the line is set. Based on Bruen, we have our hands full with a lawsuit because they're saying, no, you cannot restrict us. It's got to go down to 18. And so now we got to dig into what 18-year-olds could do in 1789, because that's the analysis we have to indulge in. We also have a lot of defendants convicted of felon in possession of a firearm, which is a serious mandatory minimum sentence in the United States, in Minnesota, saying that that's an unconstitutional law, and that under Bruen, they should not have to, there should be no such law as that. So we'll find out where we're going with this. Actually, I see some expansion. I mean, everything that A.G. Bonta said was dead on correct. But I look at the trajectory between Heller and Bruen. Where's this going? Yeah. I'm a little concerned about it. And trust me, people who want to expand guns, they're testing those boundaries. So I just thought I'd share that.
If I could chime in on that.
Yeah, please do.
Because a couple of weeks ago, I sat before a panel, the Seventh Circuit, while my Deputy Solicitor General argued to uphold a district court's decision on our assault weapons ban. And the oral arguments reflected the panel struggling with the Bruin decision, and though the proponents of striking down the district court's decision, basically arguing that it should be sort of a race and a popularity contest. So if no matter what the weapon, if enough Americans own it, and if they're able to race fast enough to have enough Americans own it, their argument is that the states or the country cannot do anything to stop that, and that's disturbing. That's not what that in no way is what was meant in because arguably everybody could get a bazooka, a cannon, or a tank, and if enough people go out and buy the tanks, then
Common use.
Bruin would protect those from owning. So we've gone to a place of these sort of nonsensical arguments that really threaten our public safety.
General Ellison, just for this audience who may not be aware of your reference going back to 17-something, could you explain that part of Bruin and why it's such a ridiculous ruling?
Well, so now the Supreme Court is essentially arguing that it's sort of a textualism plus, meaning we're going to go by what the words say as they were intended to be understood when they were written. So when were they written? 1789? So we got to figure out what's going on in 1789. I mean, and this not just Bruin. I mean, it's also Dobbs, right? I mean, they're quoting cases that were pre-Magna Carta. So that's the problem. They're asking us to analyze these cases based on the understanding and the usage at the time that the document was written, which is absolutely a dangerous, ridiculous way to interpret the Constitution. But it's a majority in the U.S. Supreme Court right now.
I'm going to change topics a little bit. General Bonta, when you did your introduction, you mentioned that text you received from your daughter. My school's on lockdown, and I think about, as a parent, receiving that text myself and our reaction. And one thing that every single one of you has mentioned at some point in our conversation so far is this notion of trauma. And, I think it's really lost in this conversation. We look at guns as well. That's my constitutional right. We look at guns as an issue of instantaneous violence. In the moment of the shooting, what happens? But I think very often lost in the conversation is the long-term impact and ramifications of shootings, including trauma. And obviously, Pastor Mitchell, this is right up your alley. So I'm going to lead with you, but General Bonta, I want to hear from you right after the pastor as well, because I want to talk about, what trauma that leaves you as a parent receiving that call, because I don't think it's something we ordinarily explicitly recognize. So, Pastor, please.
I never thought that this would be my reality when I thought about trauma. Sometimes you think about gun violence, and I remember with my mom, the trauma was hers, so I didn't have to visualize it or receive it at that level until it happened to me. And it being not a common practice as it is today, there were no resources available when I lost my son. And so I kind of traveled that road trying to figure out what to do with myself and how to find me, because I knew, people say that you'll get to a new norm, but there's no such thing as a new norm. Normal is here, where Kenneth and I resided together. And so I realized that I will never reach that level of happiness. And I had to learn to create a new narrative for myself, that a place that would allow me to be happy and at the same time coexist with Kenneth in his absence, but to maintain the memories. People often, the public and legislators, think that gun violence is just the issue. And it is. But there are subsets to gun violence, which is why I started to move away, because every town, Moms Demand Action, our advocate and survivor groups that are 70 local groups across the nation, and I'm sorry, 700 local groups. So there's plenty of experts out there that are challenging legislation. There were not that many people that were talking about the trauma that comes on a personal level, the trauma that comes on a historical level, and the trauma that comes on a community level. And until we deal with all of those issues, you cannot offer a person hope when in their community they don't see it, they don't visualize it, and the disparity of it is so far reaching, and it is ingrained in the institutions that make up this country that are not made up in favor of people of color. And so that trauma is an everyday trauma that we live with. You know, even if you look at the pandemic brought a set of trauma. But for us, we were dealing with 3 pandemics at that point in time. We were dealing with the pandemic of gun violence. We were dealing with the pandemic of COVID. We were dealing with the pandemic of white supremacy by administration that showed us no respect during that time. And so trauma is very far-reaching. 12 years into my son's death was when I received it at a major level, and everything about me changed to the point that I didn't even know me. And I had to reintroduce myself to myself. I had to take the time to do the work to allow myself to heal. It's not easy when you don't see yourself anymore, and you have to try to get out your own brain. So trauma is real. It is my platform. It's the one I speak about. I heard Generation Z talk about this morning. What has propelled them into action is they're tired of living lives that have been locked down most of their lives, and they're traumatized from being locked down. Not the test they took, but the fact that after the test, they had to do a test on being locked down and how to survive a mass gun shooting. This should not be our reality. This should not be where we're at. And so trauma is real on so many levels, and even after mine, and I'm gonna shut off after this, but you know, same community. 3 years later, the Lane Bryant shooting, my son's best friend's sister was killed in that shooting. We were parents that raised these kids up together. I had to sit on the front row with her almost 3 years to the date of my son's killing, from the same community, same front row. And she apologized to me through the whole time she was trying to make peace with her losing her only daughter, and apologizing to me knowing that I was in my morning session as well. These are real life stories. This is real. This is nothing that you can make up. So I always challenge people. Get involved, get engaged. A gun, a bullet knows no zip code. But when it comes to a community that doesn't believe it happened to them, there's a sense of loss of innocence. And your lives too will never be the same. So consider when you say it's not happening in my community, that's just on the south or the west side of Chicago. Highland Park did not expect that. But it impacted every last one of us, because even we understood the loss of innocence. And Mayberry would never be the same again for those old enough to remember Mayberry. So, thank you.
You know,
Thank you.
Kyle, if I could.
Does General Bonta want to go first? Then,
yeah, sure.
And then afterwards, I'll have you chime in as well, please.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. George, thank you for raising the issue of sort of the experience that parents have who all want to kiss their kids goodbye in the morning when they drop them off at school or wherever it might be, and give them a hug at night. And I shared my own experience just to sort of share how prevalent, ubiquitous the impacts of gun violence are. But I also really want to focus on what young people are facing in America, where gun violence and gun wounds are the leading cause of death for children. And that's where when I would go into classrooms in the district I so proudly represented in California in the East Bay, I would ask young people, how many of you have been impacted by gun violence? And almost every time, every child raised their hand. And that is not the country we want to grow up in and want our kids to grow up in, and that they should have to grow up in. And trauma is real. We need, adverse childhood experiences affect life outcomes and life trajectories and health impacts. And we need to provide trauma-informed care and healing and support for our young people and understand what the trauma of gun violence in our communities, what it does. We've all heard the phrase, hurt people hurt people. And we know that when folks are the victims of gun violence, there's also a possibility that they might want to retaliate in their pain and in their anguish and in their suffering. And I've supported programs in California where we seek to interrupt the cycle of violence, literally in the hospital, at the bedside, where the individual who's been shot is recovering, and to provide them support and healing in other pathways so that picking up a gun and seeking retaliation is not their action. And we've also seen in places like Stockton, where gun violence is at record highs, that a good amount of the gun violence was being perpetrated by a smaller group of individuals. And when we looked at who those individuals were, they were suffering from housing insecurity and food insecurity and lack of job opportunities and economic mobility. And when we gave them those things, they made different decisions and they put down the guns. And so we need to acknowledge and address trauma for what it is and intervene. And the answer looks like saturating those suffering from trauma with services and programs and healing. Understand that they're victims and they need support. And when we provide them with victims compensation funds or Medicaid support for healthcare and for healing or counseling or whatever it may be, they can make different decisions. So thank you for lifting up the importance of addressing trauma caused by gun violence.
General Raoul?
Yeah, well said by both Brenda and Rob. Years ago when I was in the legislature, I spoke on a panel that was hosted by Moms Demand Action, and there was a question that was asked, and they said, if there's one thing, just one thing that you would ask us to focus on, what would it be? And I forgot who else was on the panel, but some people said background checks, some people said assault weapons, and when it came around to me, I said, get to know the shooter. I said, get to know the shooter, because I know nobody who came out of the womb with a gun in their hands and a heart to take their neighbor. Something happened in the course of their lives that developed them into that person. And to the extent that we take that approach, and that's why I changed the nomenclature of our Crime Victim Services division to Crime Victim Services and Violence Prevention. We're going to be in Minnesota for the Democrat AG's conference, but they were here in Chicago a couple of months ago, and we did a field trip to the Institute of Nonviolence, where Ready Chicago is, and they're doing that intervention work that Rob was speaking of. It's one of the organizations that we fund. We have an opportunity to do some limited funding, and I've expanded who we fund to make sure that we're funding intervention organizations. There's something else that Brenda said that I think is just so critical, and I said it in my inauguration speech 4.5 years ago. I said, we're often surprised when gun violence visits a place like Highland Park, right? And it leads to a robust rallying cry. Maybe a week or so after the mass shooting in Highland Park, there was a mass shooting about a block away from where I raised my children in Washington Park. It didn't make the national news. It didn't. It barely made the news for a day or so in Chicago. We've got to get to a place where there's nowhere geographically where we expect shootings to happen, where we're surprised when it happens anywhere. And until we have that attitude, until we have that same robustness about when gun violence happens anywhere, we're not going to solve this problem. I said it about heroin years ago, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't adequately addressed when it was quarantined to inner city neighborhoods. Once it spread out, there's intent. Gun violence, I said it during the debate, I said gun violence is today's heroin.
So,
Yeah, I mean, if I could just say, it's important to just from a political organizing standpoint, to just, when we talk about victimization, you got the suicide victimization, which we mentioned. Then you got the accidents. Just maybe some, preteen showing his friend dad's gun, bam, happens with shocking frequency. Then you have what I would call the dispersed but still mass shooting, meaning one happened on that street, one happened, it happens all over, Then you got the straight up mass shooting. Then you got this domestic violence thing. If you look at all of these ways people are negatively impacted, yes, you have a group of people who have suffered unimaginably, but you also have a powerful political constituency. And we have to continue to knit that together and to help all these disparate groups see how we need to move out together on this. Because at the end of the day, this is, and we are at Netroots, right? This is corporate power, right? Corporate power married with extreme conservatism, borderline authoritarian fascism in some of this stuff, against everybody else, right? And the way they perpetuate it is they make us think that that our victimhood is different from your victimhood, and we got to bring it all together. And so, just a few reflections.
yeah, please.
This morning, and I'm not going to be long with this one, I just want to piggyback on what's being said, in that we cannot operate in isolation because the picture is far bigger and greater than myself or anybody else. And until we actually realize what happened in Illinois in January, all the groups came together and insisted that the PICA Act would be passed up until the midnight hour, and I think it took days for us to get that done. But all of the organization, and the House Speaker said the reason this was a success was because everybody came together under one unified umbrella to make that happen. This morning, David Hogg said, and I congratulated him for not allowing the media to make Parkland shooting about them, but to understand that the reality of what happened to them is an everyday life experience for those on the south and the west side of Chicago and other neighborhoods across the country. It was never about him, and that's the same thing that I have some wonderful people that are part of Moms Demand Action and Everytown Survivor that are victims of that Highland Park. And I often say, we cannot lose sight of the reason why we're here. We're not here because of my son Kenneth. We're not here because of Highland Park. We're here because the drama is still being played out amongst the masses, and not one of us can do what all of us can do together. Paul Murray was one of the allies out of Connecticut that was able to help us and help make phone calls from another state to make sure it happened. And so, as Attorney General Ellison said, we have to come together, not be divided by, well, is yours important because you lost a child, or is yours important because there was a suicide or domestic violence? It has to be about, it happened to all of us.
That's right. Can I ask you to add? So I know you probably got a plan.
No, I'm loving this because you're leading into my next question. So go ahead.
I would like us to spend some time, if y'all care to, on how this Second Amendment fetishism, that's what it is feeding authoritarianism and anti-democracy. Because you see these January 6th people, and they have put AR-15s in a little like a lapel pin. And so when I see that, I think what they're saying is, I'm going to kill you to get my way. I think it is important it's critical to talk about how this causes suffering. But one of the casualties of the gun epidemic is our democratic way of life. And you may criticize American democracy, but you're gonna miss it when it's gone. And I think that is a topic that we've got to lift up, because in nearly all of this, you show me a person who's guns here, guns there, guns everywhere, and I'll show you a person who's probably promoting racial division, authoritarianism, lack of democracy. So I just set it on the table.
Well, that actually segues into my next question. So again, you teed it up for me. I'm going to set it back to you to hit out the park. So
you probably just answered it.
Oh,
no. We can go into this a little more, I think. So one of the things that a theme we've really explored over the last few months is the idea of having the right attorneys general in place. And General Ellison is a very key example of that. Historically, in this country, we've had a very difficult time prosecuting police officers for line of duty deaths of civilians. It's almost impossible to do, some would say. But we saw the difference that having the right attorney general, the right prosecutor make in George Floyd specifically. We had a robust conversation about this a few weeks ago. I want to get into that, but I also want to talk more generally, because we've been very responsive so far in this conversation about, well, they're doing this, and they're doing this, and they're attacking us in this way. But let's talk about the power of attorneys general themselves, which is a very powerful office, and you do have tools at your disposal to fight back. So let's recapture momentum here, and let's talk about how we can do that. I think you're a good person to start, General.
Well, you know, General Raoul, they sued the ATF because they were not upholding the law properly. The attorney generals have, it's a very powerful job. People ask me, Kwame, I don't know if you got this question, but when I left Congress to run for AG, I had a lot of friends ask me if I needed my head examined. And I was like, no, man, the AG's office is where it's at, you know? You can initiate a lawsuit on behalf of the people of your state. We don't work for the governor. In our states, we're allies with the governors, but we're not a direct report to the governor. So we have a lot of freedom, and we can take action that we need. You know, on the issue of the police stuff. I mean, and I kind of think I'll leave you to tell the full story, but I'll just say when Trump got in, Jeff Sessions, who was the U.S. AG, said we're not going to enforce any consent decrees between police and the DOJ. And Lisa Madigan and then Kwame said, we are. And so they're doing meaningful in lifting that up. And I don't want you to have to brag on yourself, so I'll do it for you. But I mean, there's a but there's a lot of but the point is there's a lot of action that we can take. And I would urge everybody here, if you come from, is anybody here not from California, Illinois, or Minnesota? Okay. We want you to go talk to your AG about what they can do to help you advance the cause of gun safety, right? Because there's a lot of power there coming from suing the federal government when necessary, suing on behalf of consumers when necessary, using the bully pulpit. There's a lot there. And here's the thing about anybody in elected office. They don't know everything. Whenever I hear people come to me and say, well, how come you haven't done this? I always say, because I haven't thought of it. I needed you to come here. You know, we need people to tell us their ideas. That's called democracy. So, and so I would urge you to make use of your AG, because there's a lot there. I'll hand it over.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that the Dem AGs were here in May, and we're going to Minnesota. Was it next in September?
Yeah.
September. We meet frequently, and it's not to travel across the country. Believe me, it's not to. It's to have that exchange. It's to have that collaborative work. Rob Bonta, for example, is doing work investigating the effects of algorithms in healthcare. And since Keith gave me a pat on the back, I'm gonna give it to Rob. And so the potential discriminatory effects of algorithms being used in healthcare. So I pick up the phone and I call Rob, and I'm picking his brain. Oh, well, how did you take off with this? Because we're about to do the same thing here in Illinois. When the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act was being introduced by Congress, we coalesced as AGs, and I said to my colleagues, I said, hey, you know, one of the things we know as a result of Jeff Sessions taking a step back is that, you know, if we have a Jeff Sessions in office or Bill Barr in office, there's not going to be an interest in patterns and practice investigations of unconstitutional policing. So it's going to need to fall to the AG. So we asked Congress to put in their language giving state AGs the powers for patterns and practice investigations. They did. Of course, the Senate didn't take it up because it was Republican-controlled Senate, but we also some of us went to our state legislatures and made sure we put it in the state statute. So we take actions collectively. We have an exchange of ideas. And just a couple of days ago, 13 Republican AGs issued a letter to Fortune 100 companies suggesting that as a result of the higher head affirmative action decision from Supreme Court, that diversity programs should be eliminated from corporate America. And they were specifically mentioning programs that targeted hiring black employees or contracting with black contractors. So we have coalesced over the last couple of days, and we are responding to this audacious, blatant racism. And so that is the power of our collective action.
General Bonta?
100%. Double click on AG Ellison and AG Raul. You know, our offices are independently very powerful in their own right, and even more powerful when we work together. And in California, we're doing the gamut when it comes to gun violence. We're defending our common sense gun laws and nation-leading gun laws in court. We're sponsoring new ones that address the newest challenges. We're taking on ghost guns. We're also implementing a program which is unique in the United States, where called the Armed Prohibited Persons System, where we have a database that shows individuals who have purchased a gun, and also we cross-check it against those who have been disqualified from having a gun because of a criminal conviction or a restraining order or other reason, or mental illness, and we remove the guns from their hands before someone can get hurt. And so we're doing that work in California, but we're also very proud to be working across the state, or the nation rather, with others, and that we're sharing notes on defensive litigation when we're defending our laws in court. We are writing amicus briefs in key cases as they move through the system, including working together on the Bruin case. We partnered with a group of progressive AGs on the merchant category codes on credit card purchases, which would eventually allow for early detection of mass shooters. We share ideas on legislation. And so that partnership is something that I really treasure, and helps make us all better at what we do. We're all better off when we're working together. There's nothing that we can't do when we work together, and I'm very proud to team up with AGs Raul and Allison and all of our Democratic AGs across the country.
Thank you, General.
How many Democratic AGs are there?
What's the number?
24?
24.
Oh, that's comforting. I thought maybe 3.
But since you asked, first of all, we got.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me repeat the question for those watching online.
How
The
many
question
AGs?
was,
How many Dem AGs? 24. But there are some important seats that are up now, like in the state of Kentucky, in the state of Louisiana. Help me out here, brother. Who else is up? Mississippi. And Mississippi had a great Dem AG for many years, Jim Hood. You know, and actually Steve Bashir was the AG in Kentucky. Now he's governor.
Andy,
thank you. And so, you know, we can win these races, but we've got to be competitive in them. And when Republican AGs are openly saying they're threatening private companies who do diversity, right, All of them are are opposed to any kind of gun sense. These are races that we need you guys to really click into. And so I'll stop right there.
I know we're out of time. Let's take that last question. Yeah, I think you've been patient, so let's get that.
I'm not aware of how it works, but the big tobacco lawsuits, are there comparisons here? And is there any way we can, like...
So repeat the question, please, AG.
What about big tobacco lawsuits? Okay, so here's a problem with a big tobacco style lawsuit, which we deal with opioids, which we do all the time. There's something called the purchase in the PLACA.
PLACA.
Purchase in lawful commerce in firearms. There's this immunities law for guns, and so we can still sue if you have deceptive advertising, if you have product defect, which is a little, and you can sue for negligent sales, negligent entrustments, and nuisance. But it's right now the law it creates certain barriers, but it's not impossible. So you gotta think about it, but it certainly can be done, and
Yeah. So I sort of referenced earlier on that the Illinois legislature, at my request, just passed what we call the Firearm Industry Responsibility Act, which clarifies that our existing Consumer Fraud and Deceptive Practices Act applies to the firearms industry the same as it does the tobacco industry, the predatory lending industry, opioids. It's the same tool that we used for all of those individual and collective actions. And so there is a predicate exception in PLACA that allows for exceptions for state law for violating state law, and our Consumer Fraud Deceptive Practicing Act is existing state law. In Connecticut, it's been tested. They sued. There was a suit against Remington, I believe, and there was an appeal of that all the way up to the Connecticut Supreme Court, and the suit was upheld, and cert was denied by the United States Supreme Court. So it's a demonstration of it can be done. There's litigation in several states with regards to the approaches that have been taken in several states. I know California is one of them, so Rob, you can speak to that. But as soon as the governor signs FIRA, I'm sure we're going to face some sort of litigation with regards to it.
Just so you know, in Minnesota, they filed to dismiss our lawsuit, and we survived. And our case is going on. And that's even in the 8th Circuit, which is one of the most conservative circuits in the country. So we're moving, we're doing it. I'll just note that the gun companies make representations that having guns all over the place creates greater safety. And we can prove statistically and personally that is not true. So if they're making claims in their advertising that this is going to create safety in your home, and we can show that it actually doesn't. I mean, that's a theory. And then the other thing they do that I think is false advertising is they sort of say that this is going to restore your manhood. If you ever look at these ads, they say reclaim your manhood card, buy a AK-47, and so they're sort of marketing to these things. So I think there are lawsuits that are possible here.
We had a manufacturer here in Illinois that was advertising the JR-15. Own one like your mom and dad.
So if I could just jump in real quick, that PLACA statute that was referenced by A.G. Ellison and Raul is federal immunity for the firearms industry. It should not exist. It should be repealed. No, the firearms industry should not have immunity. And
repeal it.
it provides a narrow pathway for states to pass laws to create responsibilities that, if violated, can lead to liability. And as AG Raul was stating, different states are doing that. California's done it, New York's done it, Illinois is on the verge of doing it, other states are doing it. It requires them to take steps to prevent the sale of firearms to people who shouldn't have it, straw purchasers, those who are prohibited for other reasons. Make sure they take safety measures so that firearms aren't stolen and then used in crimes. So there's a pathway that we are exploring and will be using to hold the firearms industry accountable. But the real bigger barrier is at the federal level, and that immunity should be repealed. In the meantime, these laws that we've passed to create a pathway for liability and accountability for the firearms industry are being challenged in court. And so we're defending our recent law in California and hope and believe that we will uphold it and be able to hold the firearms industry accountable when they break the law.
Thank you. We are out of time. I do think it's right that we give Pastor Mitchell the last word here, right? So Pastor Mitchell, please take us home.
Not a problem. And I'm just going to say, I'm never going to let the attorney generals or anyone else say that the preachers take up all of the space. Thank you. But what I do want to say is, and I'll be brief because the day isn't long, I do want to say thank you to these attorney generals up here, these forward-thinking, progressive, innovative attorney generals that have allowed me as a survivor to occupy this space with them today. It is important, it's critical that we elect the right people in office, which is why we're so targeted about the work that we do. If you're not at the table, you cannot affect change. I'm thankful, and I've shared platforms before with Attorney General Raul, and I'm thankful that the conversations are always had, and we're generally on the same page. Where I know as a constituent, my voice is going to be heard, and in the right place, appropriate action will be taken. He's on the front line. Attorney General Ellison in California, Attorney General. This is progression. This is innovation. This is what we as John Q. Public have to be about, supporting them when they need us to show up and be accounted for as well. We're part of We the People.
Thank you, everyone.
Good job, man. Thanks a lot, brother.